Hey, what's up folks? In this video, we're going to be analyzing another game submitted to our Patreon. And yeah, this game is really going to be all about the end game. They'll talk a little bit about the opening and middle game as well, because I think a lot of very common mistakes are made by both sides in this end game. And so I just want to talk about how we can maybe improve that aspect of our game. So this was a classical game played online between Falk playing white and Mitch Fabian playing black, two of our dojo regulars. And this was played on Lichess, so I have their Lichess classical ratings here. They're a little bit inflated. I would probably estimate the OTB ratings of these two players, maybe Falk being around 1600, and Mitch being the higher rated player, maybe something like 1900. But this is just my estimate to give you guys an idea. And so this was played at a time control of 45 minutes per side with a 30-second increment. And okay, let's get into it. So d4, d5. c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6. Black is playing a classic Slav defense here, and white goes for g3. I actually talked a little bit about how to deal with g3 Catalan type setups for Slav players and semi-Slav players in the latest opening lab that you can find on this YouTube channel. But Mitch goes bishop f5 here, which I think is a very reasonable move. When Black is able to develop this light-scored bishop, I think generally this is a good thing. If we quickly take a look at the classical Slav with knight to c3, here bishop f5 is known to be a pretty dubious move because white can quickly play queen to b3 and attack the d5 pawn. I think actually taking on d5 is more accurate, followed by queen to b3. With this attack on b7 plus pressure on d5, and it becomes very, very difficult for black to defend here, since queen b6 is met with knight takes d5, followed by knight takes f6 check in case of the trade of queens, and white is just winning a clean pawn. So when white does not play in the most ambitious way and does something different, it often makes sense for black to get the bishop out, because here after bishop f5, if white were to play queen b3 or cd5 followed by queen b3, black can typically meet that with queen to b6 and actually doesn't really experience any problems in that endgame since white is not winning any material. So the game goes bishop g2, e6, and once again, if white plays queen b3 here, black can just calmly play queen to b6, and there's no real danger for black. If c5, I think black can either go back, but I would probably just go for this endgame here, where I would say that white's bishop on g2 is frankly just not a very good piece against this kind of triangle structure, because this d5 square is so solid, and the bishop doesn't really have any targets. And here black can play something like h6 to secure their own bishop, or knight a6 to fight for the b4 square, and I think black is doing absolutely fine. Lots and lots of moves here. The game continues bishop g5. And now black goes queen to b6, and a really interesting move. In Mitch's words, he unpins from the bishop on g5 and puts pressure on this b2 pawn that white's bishop just left behind. So really a very logical move, and objectively I think nothing wrong with this move. To my eyes, personally, I think I would just go bishop e7 here without too much thought. And my feeling here is, okay, black develops a piece. We neutralize the pin in a much more natural way. And with the bishop on g5 not really having a lot of room to back up, black's next move is just going to be h6, and either white is going to have to lose a tempo to go back or give up the dark squared bishop, both of which I think are suitable. So like castles h6, and I don't think white's intentions were to just lose a tempo and retreat with the bishop. h6 is a very useful move here for black. I think white probably just takes on f6, and then black gets the pair of bishops, and I think is absolutely fine. Position is still very close to equal, but personally I like the two bishops, and I think I would go here as black. Well, queen b6 is played, and to Mitch's credit, he does get a very good position very quickly, as white messes up with bishop takes f6, probably my guess is expecting gf6, but black very carefully throws in queen takes b2, which is a great decision, because black grabs a pawn, and this is kind of like a nice in-between move type tactic. Black hits the rook on a1. So if white wants to save the bishop, bishop g5, bishop e5, black is going to take on a1, and then this knight is hanging as well. a2 pawn is hanging. White is losing a lot of material. We also have bishop b4 check in the position as well, and yeah, no good for white. So queen takes b2, black is able to snag a pawn, white goes knight d2. Now black recaptures, g takes f6. And so here black has won a pawn and gotten the dark squared bishop. And so white has a little bit of compensation, but we have to like black's position here because the bishop on f5 is actually a very, very useful piece, stopping white from ever playing rook to b1 and getting any kind of counterplay. Here white goes c5. I think probably not a great move to close the position like this. My guess is white was worried about bishop to b4. It's probably better just to castle and get going with the development. Now c5 is played. And yeah, my first thought here is I think black could have gotten just a really nice position with just the immediate bishop c2. It feels like kind of a computery move, but the point is that we're just attacking white's queen, we're forcing queen to c1, and we're immediately getting an endgame where black has kept their extra pawn. So huge advantage for black, very, very good. And then the bishop can drop back to g6 or a4 followed by bishop b5. I would probably go bishop g6, I think it's more natural. And yeah, I think white has zero compensation here for the extra pawn. Black is just better. Knight d7, b6 is coming, and yeah, I think black is doing great. Also, the dark squared bishop eventually is going to be a good piece. So what happens instead? Instead, Mitch goes e5, which is, to me, feels like the wrong type of move for this position. Just practically speaking, we're up a pawn, we already have material, we have a very nice forcing way to just trade queens, simplify, go into the endgame, and be really comfortable. Instead, we're playing e5, creating tension in the center, possibly opening things up, while our own king is stuck on e8. So practically, I don't think this was a good decision. I think if anything, this actually just gives white a ton of chances. Again, white should just castle, and then play moves like knight h4, and yeah, I don't really see what black is doing here. I think eventually white's going to play e4 as well, and just open everything up in the center, and then black's extra pawn is going to be absolutely meaningless because the king is just going to be getting wrecked. So a bit of a practical misstep here. White goes knight h4, which is a mistake because this gives black a second chance to now play bishop to c2. And force the queens off the board. But after queen to c1, it's again not so clear. Now in this endgame, it's a completely different story that black played e5, because again, white can play e4 here, and even in the endgame, if white's rook ever gets to the e1 square, after castles and rook e1, black is going to have a really hard time with this king on e8. The other kind of obvious drawback about e5 is that it's actually just improving the scope of white's light square bishop. Now after e4, white is already threatening to just break down this diagonal, and if this diagonal ever opens up, that bishop on g2 is just an absolute monster. So Mitch doesn't go for the endgame. He actually grabs a second pawn with queen takes d4, which I think is actually the best move at this point. Grabbing the second pawn, the bishop is not hanging because the rook on a1 is still under pressure. White castles, black drops back, bishop to g6. White takes, knight takes g6. Not sure about this one, but I think it's at least reasonable. Personally, my eyes were drawn to this move e4, where the idea is just to open everything up. Black's king is on e8. White is down 2 pawns at this point, so white really needs to create some drama in the position and create some counterplay in order to actually stand a chance. So knight takes g6. HG, I don't think black is too upset about this trade. Gets to improve their structure, open up the rook, and so on. And now rook to b1. Not a bad move, attacking the pawn on b7 and getting the rook off of any potential attack. Once again, I think e4 was kind of the move to play, just to open up as many lines as possible with this pawn break. But rook b1, black goes b6. And now white takes first, and then queen to b2. And yeah, this one may be one of white's biggest mistakes in the game, because we're down 2 pawns as white, and trading queens is actually exactly what black wants to do. It simplifies the position. Without queens on the board, black's king in the center is actually going to be really well placed. The king can just go to d7 and defend all the pawns, and yeah, black is actually just going to be 2 pawns up for free. Again, white needed to just play e4 for better or worse, just try to open things up, and the position is not that simple for black to handle. Black is still behind in development, rooks are disconnected, all the pieces are on the back rank, the only piece developed is the queen. I mean, white has some real compensation here, not an easy position for black to handle whatsoever, especially the opposite color bishops, right? Giving white this kind of long-term initiative, as white is always going to be pounding on this diagonal. So quite a few practical mistakes, I would say, by both players, not really making the right decisions based on the needs of the position. So queen b2, black snaps the queen off, I imagine, very quickly, and now black just has everything. 2 extra pawns, great center, everything is well defended, and white simply doesn't have anything without the queens on the board. So at this point, I would say black is totally winning, and the game progresses kind of naturally here. Rook to c1, king to d6. The king is doing an excellent job defending everything. Rook b7, knight d7, rook c2, rook b8, trading off one pair of rooks. White goes rook b2, black takes, and then quickly goes rook to b8. Definitely not a bad move. It's very natural for black to just try to trade pieces and win with the extra material. 2 pawns. But I don't know if I would have played this move. To me, it just feels like the c pawn is already so strong that we should just push the c pawn and simply promote this one. I mean, if we notice what's happening on the queen side, we just have this super strong passed pawn. It's well backed up. We have a much more active king that's in the game. White's bishop on g2 at this point is basically dead. There's nothing white can do to open up the bishop. If e4, black is just going d4, and these 2 pawns are just running. And the rook is quite active as well. So I think black's plan here should just be to push c4, push c3, maybe even d4, rook to b8, rook b2. Oops, rook to b2, and I think the game is just over. Well, anyway, rook to b8 doesn't spoil anything. White avoids the trade. Rook b1 check, definitely a good move. Bishop f1. Knight to b6. Black starts bringing in the knight. King g2, knight to c4. Not really sure I would do this myself. Once again, I think the way black wins this endgame is by pushing the pawns forward. That's it. So sooner or later, we're just going to have to promote one of our pawns and win the game, right? So might as well get on with it. Now the pawn is defended. Again, we can go d4, c3, rook b2, and yeah, I think white just immediately collapses. But okay, knight c4, e3, rook b2, forcing a rook trade because all the pawns are hanging in the position. So takes. Again, black hasn't spoiled anything, still completely winning. Bishop e2, c4, king f1, and now king to c5. And generally, I like this instinct to kind of move with the king, activate the king, use the king to help advance the pawns forward. Generally, the king is a very, very important piece in the endgame. Here, I just don't know if it's necessary. I mean, our pawns are so strong. We can go c3 here, and now white is in time, so we're not just promoting immediately. c2, king d2, the pawn is stopped. But we can get the second pawn going, and the truth is I don't think black needs the king here anymore. I mean, this pawn is just coming to d3 and then c2 or d2, and I think the knight and the 2 pawns can promote all on their own. White just can't hold against the pawns. It's going to have to give up the bishop at some point. It's just game over. So this would have been, I think, a very simple finish. But okay, instead we get king to c5. Again, not spoiling anything yet. King to e1. And now knight to d3 check. And so this is where we really start to get into the heart of the matter. And I think the title for this video, not official yet at this point, but I think it's going to be the most common mistake in the endgame. And really the main point I want to make here is that, I checked out the game on Lichess. And at this point, both players have well over half an hour. They started with 45 minutes. And at this point, they have way more than 30 minutes. So neither player has really used that much time to get to this point. And from here on, I noticed that the game develops very quickly. I mean, the players are just making moves really, really fast. And I don't want to give these guys too much grief. I know for Mitch, this was his first classical game in quite some time, so he's definitely out of practice. But for players of this level, 15, 16, 17, 1800 OTB and up, the type of mistakes they make, in this next phase of the game are really, I just want to say, inexcusable. And again, I'm not trying to be harsh. I just want to put this out there so people can learn from the mistakes, and we can all kind of learn from this game. Because the truth is, I do see this mistake happening over and over and over again. Whenever I watch games online on Twitch, or even watch games over the board, I often see players of lower ratings blitz out the end game. They get to the end game and they think everything is so simple and they just make the first moves they see. They try to follow some consistent plan, but without really examining their options. And so the biggest mistake, and I think the most common mistake that players make in the end game, is that they just don't spend enough time. Because there's actually a lot of options, and we're going to see some more. The game is actually going to get incredibly dramatic from here, and we're going to see a lot of options, especially for black, who's trying to convert the game. From white's point of view, it's very tough. You have a completely losing endgame. Your opponent has multiple ways to win here. All you can do is just try to resist a bit and hope for some chances. But for black, you might have multiple ways of winning the game. Some might be easier, some might be more complicated. Your job is to make it as simple as possible. And so here, Mitch starts with knight to d3 check, which invites white to trade and go for the king and pawn endgame. And while this king and pawn endgame is totally winning for black, he ends up messing it up, right? And the reason for that is because it gets a little tricky. Black ends up missing one of white's ideas, and all of a sudden the game could have been completely turned around. So was going into the king and pawn endgame necessary? I don't think so. I think once again, black can just push c3, d4, d3, and the game is just over. And it's actually simpler to win, I think, with the minor pieces on the board. So knight d3 check is played, and let's see what happens. White takes, c takes d3, king d2, e4. And at first glance, it looks completely over because black has this incredibly strong protected passer. Black also has the c-pawn that can run, so in fact, black has two connected passers, which are generally completely devastating. And of course, black's king can quickly pick up this a-pawn so that it's never a concern, hopefully. White goes king c3, king b5, and black is just getting out of the way. And here, white goes g4. And I think at this point, Mitch has something like 40 minutes on his clock. And pretty much plays c5 immediately. I think this move did not take more than 30 seconds or so. Huge mistake, huge mistake, because after h4, all of a sudden, white has counterplay, and white is ready to create a pass pawn of their own. So clearly this was, completely overlooked by black here. And if black just plays one simple move g5 and stops white from getting a pass pawn, then white can resign with a safe conscience. There's no more chances anymore. Now black is just running the pawns up the board, and the game is really over. And if Mitch had just played g5 here, then I don't think I would question the move knight d3 check at all. I would say, okay, you went for the king and pawn endgame, you knew it was winning, and it looks like it was winning easily, so well done. But no, we missed the idea, c5, white goes h4, and this is not like the craziest move that white could come up with. It's not some insane brilliancy that, we missed. White's last move was g4, right? So when we're playing chess, we have to appreciate that the opponent is trying to do something, right? Usually our opponents have some idea in mind. They're going to be playing for some plan. Even if they're completely busted, humans like to hope, right? We like to hope for something. We always play for some idea. And so with g4, it should have been very clear. It should have been actually immediately obvious what white is wanting to do. White wants to play h4, h5, and make a pass pawn of their own, and all of a sudden create some serious counterplay. Had white started with h4, kind of a similar idea, then black can play f5 in this case and stop the pawns and totally winning. And so once again, this is the biggest mistake that players make. They simply don't spend enough time. I'm not sure exactly why this is, and I don't think it's exclusive to online chess. I've seen it a lot in online chess, online classical. It's not like it's in a blitz game and you don't have a lot of time to think. We're talking about classical chess here. You have 30, 40 minutes on the clock. And I've seen this happen plenty in over-the-board chess as well with many of my students. For whatever reason, I think people get a little bit too, jittery when they get to the end game, or they think it's all simple, or they think they know exactly what they need to do. Try to trade everything off, try to take the opposition, try to do this, try to push the pawns. But the truth is that endgames are complicated. You got to spend your time, right? Endgame is one of the most complicated phases of the game. And we've seen so many strong players, world champions, make all kinds of endgame mistakes. It happens to everyone. Things can get very tricky, even though there's fewer pieces on the board. And if you miss one idea, You might lose the game, you might draw the game, from a completely winning position. It can be very painful. So my advice to these players and to everyone watching, when you get into the endgame, spend time. Even if it feels like the simplest endgame in the world, try to spend a little bit of time. Make sure you're not missing anything easy. And you don't know. Even the thing is, you might think that the endgame is simple, but your evaluation on that might be wrong. The endgame might be actually much more complicated than you give it credit for, right? And so the only way to work against that, to avoid falling into this kind of trap, is to just spend a little bit of time, especially if you have time on the clock. If you've got 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you're in no rush. If the position is winning, it's winning, right? So you might as well spend a little bit of time, make sure it's winning. And if it is winning, then you're not going to need that time later on, right? If you have 20 minutes, you can afford to spend a couple minutes just double and triple checking that you have everything under control. Please do this, guys, before you blow some endgames and it turns out to be really painful, especially in some tournament. You're playing for some big prize. It's the last round. You're playing for a norm. You don't want to rush in the endgame and mess it up. We've all done it. It happens to literally every player. Try as much as you can to sit on your hands, think about the position, and don't move until you're absolutely sure. So h4. Now we have a full-up race. Black is trying to push the pawns forward. Pushes c4, white goes h5, king b4. It's not even clear who's faster at this point. h6, c3 check. And here it's actually a very critical moment for white. If you'd like to pause the video and think about what white should play here, this is exactly the moment where you should try to spend a lot of time, because one move might lose, another move might draw. Now the king doesn't really want to go to e1 here. That doesn't seem right, as black is going to be able to promote the pawns with tempo. So white is really choosing here between king to d1 and king to c1. Now how should you make this decision? Should you try to logically decipher which of these moves makes more sense and play it? Or should you just try to calculate and work it out concretely? My feeling is you should calculate. You can always use logic to come up with a reason why king d1 is good or why king c1 is good. You might say, oh, king c1 is better because it's closer to the black king, or king d1 is better because it avoids this. The truth is, it's very hard to use logic to find the right move. You just need to calculate. White goes king d1, which is the wrong choice, because after black plays king a3, here white realizes all of a sudden that white is not in time. If white plays h7, black is going king b2. And white will promote first, but black is hitting the king with check. And if king to d2, we're promoting with check. If king to e1, we're promoting with check. And black is completely winning. Had white played king to c1 instead, then black is not in time. And the point here is that if black plays c2, maybe this is what white was afraid of, with idea h7, king c3, white promotes not with check, and black mates with d2. Well, instead of this, white can actually just play the move king to b2. And in fact, black's king doesn't get in, black's pawns don't promote, and white is actually winning the game with h7, h8. Now, of course, it's no guarantee that black would have pushed c2 here. Black should instead play king to a3 with an idea we'll see in the game to distract the white's king. But compared to the game, white has an extra tempo here, because now white can push h7, and after d2, king c2, black can promote with check, king takes, king to b2, white promotes first. Black will also promote, but after king to e2, black is not promoting with check. White's queen gets the first move. White can play queen takes f6, check, and then white is actually totally fine. The queen can take on f7 next, and black might have some winning chances, but white is actually objectively totally okay. So kind of an unfortunate error from white. King to c1 would have surprisingly saved the game. Instead, white goes king d1, but now after king a3, white realizes, like I showed, h7, king to b2, black is now just promoting with check and winning the game. The d pawn is just going to be too strong in the queen and pawn endgame. So on king a3, white now goes king to c1 and loses a very, very critical tempo. And of course, this tempo decides everything. d2 check, king c2, black promotes, king takes d1, king b2, h7. Now black is the one that's promoting first in this endgame, which is very important because it means white doesn't have a chance to take on f6 with check. black gets the first check, and now black should be winning this queen and pawn endgame. So king f1, we give check, queen d2, black repeats once, queen f3 check, king g1, and then black takes on g4. I actually don't think this was the right call. Black is still completely winning, of course. I think the e3 pawn is the one we want to take first with check. We can always come back for the g4 pawn, but I think we want to take this one first so that our own e-pawn can win the game. And from here, the win is very simple for black. I mean, the pawn is just way too strong, the queen is too active, and black has too many pawns. So all black needs to do is just put the queen back on f3, just push the e-pawn, and win the game. White will have some checks against their own king, but it will never be enough. For example, king h2, let's say we give this check, we give this check, we push e3, white can give queen b8 check, let's say, but the king can run to f2 and we'll always be able to find shelter. We'll also be able to create some mating threats at some point with queen to g3 check, in addition to just pushing and promoting the pawn. In fact, black can even first snap this pawn, because white has nothing to do here except give a bunch of checks, and once again the king can run, find safety, and yeah, black just has too many pawns here for white to survive. So it's kind of a slow win, but it's an absolute sure win. Instead, black plays queen takes g4 check, white goes king to h1, and black decides to force the trade of queens with queen to h5. And so this is unfortunately another illustration of the problem here. And we actually have one of the most amazing double blunders that I've ever seen in my life. No joke. Really one of the most amazing double blunders, because this is actually completely blowing the game for black. And to my shock, white resigned in this position. And I can totally understand the feeling from both players. Black is up a million pawns in the endgame, is thinking, okay, I just need to trade queens and I have a bunch of extra pawns, the game is over. And I think white kind of felt black's confidence, also came to the same conclusion and decided to resign. I lose my queen, no more chances of a perpetual, I'm down a bunch of pawns in the king and pawn endgame, let's not waste time to resign. And at this point, I think black here had something like 40 minutes, 42 minutes. Again, started with 45, so really hadn't spent a ton of time throughout the game. There is 30-second increment, so a lot of the time has been added back on, and white had something like 30 minutes here. And by now you've probably realized why queen h5 is such a crazy blunder. Well, after the queen trade and g takes h5, it's white to play, and white can play the move a2, a4. And all of a sudden, white's passed a-pawn is just as strong, if not stronger, than the rest of black's pawns on the other side of the board. And actually, black has to play super accurately here not to lose the game. As it turns out, after the race, both sides are just in time. a6, f takes e3. White can start with this clever move king to g2, trying to stop the pawns. And then black is just in time with this h-pawn to promote. So a7, h3 check, and yeah, both sides promote at the same time. Black might still have some chances in this endgame, although white is able to immediately pick up one of the pawns, and black is just going to be left with one extra pawn. But yeah, objectively, it's a draw. Maybe black can still win it, but compared to the endgame that we started with and some of the endgame positions we've had in this game, the fact that white could reach this position by force is just an absolute miracle, right? And who knows, maybe black would have messed up and not even gotten to this point. So yeah, insane case of double blindness, let's call it, with both players just making this really basic but flawed assumption that, trading queens is always good, right, when you're 2 pawns up. And unfortunately, this kind of thing happens all the time in the endgame. Like I mentioned, it's not just online chess, it happens in over-the-board chess as well. It happens to players much stronger than this occasionally as well, but it's just something to learn from, something to watch out for. So really my only goal with this video is to just plead with you, really plead to try to take your time in the endgame, spend some time, even if you're not thinking concretely about the position, just spend a couple minutes when you're winning to absolutely make sure that you're not messing something up. I'm sure these players are strong enough to know that the pawn is capable of advancing 2 squares. I think that's part of the rules of the game. I think they're aware of this rule, but it's just something that happens when we think things are easy, we rush, and then we miss some of the most obvious things we can imagine. With that, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully it was instructive, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care.